Okay, everybody. Well, thanks for joining us today. As we finish our year of academic talks, we have something that's a little bit different than what we typically discuss during our meetings, but something that I thought was quite interesting. And I'm very happy that Dr. Golbus and Dr. Yao have made the time to join us today to talk about their research. So, to introduce them, Jessica Golbus is an advanced heart failure and transplant cardiologist at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the use of mobile health technology to improve cardiovascular disease outcomes. She is actively involved in a number of research studies using mobile technology to promote behavioral modification for patients with heart failure or hypertension and for those enrolled in cardiac rehabilitation. Furthermore, she is interested in optimizing treatments for patients with advanced heart failure, and this includes using artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify the optimal time to deploy heart failure advanced therapies. Her co-author on the paper that they are going to discuss is Dr. Heming Yao. Dr. Yao is an AI scientist at Genentech. She holds a PhD in the field of computational medicine and bioinformatics from the University of Michigan. Her research focus is to develop data-driven artificial intelligence systems for biomedical applications. She is interested in improving the generalization and interpretability of machine learning and deep learning models in medicine. So thank you both to Dr. Golbus and Dr. Yao for joining us today. Really interested to learn about your research and hear what you have to say. Dr. Golbus, I'm going to make you co-host. So if there's any slides to share, and I'll do the same for Dr. Yao as well, just in case that she has anything to share.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Beasley. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you all for the kind introduction. I'm going to start us off here, and then I'm going to let Heming take over when we talk about the method. So this was work that we did jointly. I really, while I had the clinical question, Heming is really the one that did all of the hard work on this. So I'm excited that she's here today as well. So this is going to be based on our recent publication on identifying potential candidates for advanced heart failure therapies using an interpretable machine learning model. And we'll talk about what that means. So this work has been funded through a National Science Foundation grant. And I'm just going to set the clinical stage here, although certainly this group is certainly well aware of the problem. I know this is a statistic that we all know, 6.2 million Americans with heart failure increasing to greater than 8 million by 2030. And we're specifically interested for this work in the pre-D or stage D heart failure population. So specifically those patients that are kind of on the precipice of needing advanced therapies and certainly warrant referral to an advanced heart failure cardiologist. And this is a growing group with an annualized incidence of about 5%, although arguably that number could be larger given some gaps that we have in identifying this pre-D heart failure. And as we know, this group of patients, and as they progress, has an exceptionally high mortality. So how do we manage this patients? Well, certainly we all know here that heart transplantation and LVAD offer patients the best chance for long-term survival with improved quality of life. Certainly we all know that there's a supply-demand mismatch for heart transplantation, and there's risk of both morbid and mortal complications with both therapies. Premature heart transplant and LVAD implantation expose patients to potentially unnecessary adverse outcomes, though delayed delivery places patients at risk for clinical deterioration and poor outcomes. This is the problem we face every day. There's this tension, thus, between premature and delayed implantation of advanced heart failure therapies. So currently, the timing of advanced heart failure therapies is determined by us, heart failure and transplant cardiologists, and this is largely based on evidence-based heuristics, clinical practice, our heart failure and transplant fellowship, but we really are not the majority, taking care of the majority of heart failure patients. Now, that's even the case for us at Michigan. I'm not sure what it is at Yale, but we take care of about a third of the heart failure patients. Certainly in the inpatient setting. And then when you even think about the broader group of heart failure patients that are not cared for in academic medical centers, the vast majority of these patients are cared for by general cardiologists and primary care clinicians. And certainly under recognition of illness severity by such providers may lead to delayed referral to a heart failure and transplant cardiologist, over which time patients can develop complications which eventually preclude advanced therapies. Well, how do providers currently decide when to refer patients to an advanced heart failure cardiologist? Well, there's a couple of ways. Certainly, we all kind of are aware of the mnemonic "I need help." There's also this recent publication by Dr. Morris, which came out in 2021, which was guidance for timely and appropriate referral of patients with advanced heart failure. And this guideline proposed a two-step process, with step one requiring that providers identify that the patient has advanced heart failure, and then as part of step two, consider whether the patient would benefit from having their care coordinated through an advanced heart failure specialist. And the problem with this is that it requires very manual recognition on the part of the non-heart failure specialist, and that they do that at the right time and refer the right patient. And certainly that can be fraught with issues. Well, what about some of the existing risk prediction models that we have? How do those do, and do those help us in this problem? Well, this was an analysis from the ESC Heart Failure Long-Term Registry that many of you may be aware of. This was conducted between May 2011 and April 2013, and this was heart failure patients participating or heart failure patients presenting to participating European centers. They were enrolled on a recurring basis for about a year, and then followed for 12 months per the usual practice of the center, but though a mandatory follow-up visit at 12 years. And notably, at enrollment, all of the cardiologists were asked whether they used a risk score to determine the patient's prognosis. So using this retrospectively, these authors did a complete case analysis looking at a number of the commonly used risk scores. So CHARM, Seattle Heart Failure Model, GISEHF, and then the MAGIC scores. And then they looked at the performance of these models with predicting 1-year mortality. So you can see in the first figure on the left that these scores had relatively modest discrimination, although the area under the curve was greater than 0.7 for all of the risk scores. But they then went down and they broke up the patients into quintiles of risk. And you can see at the individual level, these scores performed relatively poorly, particularly in the mid-range. So I show this to highlight just the limitations of our existing risk prediction models. So these have limited accuracy for individual patients. This certainly may be because they fail to capture the multidimensional relationships between variables. These are all regression-based models. And then also that, these initial risk scores were derived from clinical trial populations that are likely unrepresentative of the types of patients that we see. These clinical trials had patients that were generally less sick and that were younger. And then really importantly, in terms of the gap, none of these scores really assist at the bedside with treatment recommendations, when and who should be evaluated for heart failure advanced therapies. And again, this was the clinical gap that we wanted to address through this work. So our project objective was to develop and validate a machine learning model to identify patients with advanced heart failure warranting evaluation or referral for heart transplant or durable LVAD. And we really wanted to differentiate ourselves from some of the existing models or approaches because we wanted to first leverage existing clinical knowledge. We didn't want to develop these de novo algorithms. We also wanted to learn from the model. So we wanted to extract knowledge that we could then apply in practice. And finally, we wanted the model to provide transparent and accessible recommendations, meaning that this would not be a black box model, but the model would rather let providers know the rationale for its recommendation. And we really felt that this final bullet point was really essential because there has been kind of so much work on uptake of machine learning models, and some of the limitations in these especially clinically sensitive applications is that providers are unlikely to use them if they don't understand the rationale for the recommendation. And so that was really important for us. So with that, I will turn it over to Heming, who will explain our approach.
Am I going to present all of them? Because
Oh, you want me to? I'll go.
yeah,
through
I think
revival.
our
Okay.
plan is like you'll cover the first half of the message.
Sure. Okay. Sorry about that. So before I'm jumping into the detailed methods, I'll just give you a little bit on the cohorts that we used for this work. So this was based on two cohorts. So the first was the REVIVAL Registry. I think many of you are familiar with REVIVAL, but this was 400 patients with advanced heart failure, all had to have at least one high-risk feature, and they were enrolled from 21 US medical centers. Patients were evaluated at 6 time points. So this was very structured. So patients had data collected at baseline, 2, 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. And importantly, investigators were asked to record at each time point whether the patient had been evaluated for advanced therapies and what was the result of that evaluation. So here is just the REVIVAL roadmap to visually display what REVIVAL collected and to give you a sense of the types of variables. And I think you can all see that for the most part, REVIVAL collected variables that are pretty routine and commonly available in the electronic medical record. And so this was really important for us as we were developing this work. So looking at things like demographics, vital signs, labs, 6-minute walk distance, ECG, questionnaires, echo. And these were the data that we leveraged for our study. And again, at every time point, REVIVAL collected whether the patient had been evaluated for an advanced therapy, had received an advanced therapy, or had been hospitalized for heart failure and died. So for purposes of this work, for application to our machine learning model, we labeled patients as either positive or negative. And what we mean by that is these positive cases were patients that required a heart transplant and LVAD evaluation, and participants that were negative were those that were too well for heart transplant or LVAD. And again, this was as determined by the treating cardiologist, the advanced heart failure and transplant cardiologist. And just one thing to point out, and a limitation to some extent of this work, is that we grouped patients that were labeled as that had medical or psychosocial contraindications, but had been referred or evaluated for advanced heart failure therapies as positive cases. And the idea is that we wanted to use this model to identify patients that were sick enough to warrant a referral to an advanced heart failure specialist, but not necessarily those that would all be eligible were they evaluated. So given the size of the REVIVAL registry, which was 400 participants, we decided to combine that with the INTERMACS Registry, I know this is a registry that everybody on this call is familiar with, but this was as a North American registry of adults who received an FDA-approved MCS device at one of 170 participating INTERMACS centers. And the INTERMACS registry collects very similar data to what REVIVAL collected. And so there was really nice symmetry here in terms of the data sets. So the demographics, clinical data, surveys like KCCQ, and then certainly all clinical outcome data. And so we included all LVAD recipients over about a 10-year period. And because all of these patients received an advanced therapy, they were all labeled positive, so warranting heart transplant or LVAD evaluation. And we decided for purposes of the model to focus on variables with strong associations with advanced heart failure. So certainly we viewed this as kind of very early work. And so as we created this model, we focused on about 30 to 50 variables that we knew through prior work had at least a modest association with advanced heart failure. And importantly, we excluded New York Heart Association classification and INTERMACS profiles from our model inputs. And this was a decision that we made because we felt that these classifications were deterministic and relatively subjective. And again, our goal was to identify patients that would warrant referral to an advanced heart failure specialist. And so this may not be something that was available in practice. And so we certainly understood that this would handicap us. I think many of you know that INTERMACS classification turned out to be the most predictive variable in REVIVAL, but we really felt that we wanted to use objective data that we thought would be collected in clinical practice. And then we also created a set of clinical rules from 5 heart failure and transplant cardiologists that we used to initialize the model. And the idea was that we really wanted to capitalize on that existing clinical knowledge and then build upon it. So we reached out to 5 cardiologists, heart failure cardiologists around the country, none of which were from the University of Michigan. And we went through this iterative process to create a set of rules by which these providers would identify patients with advanced heart failure. So if patients had this and this may be a sign that this individual would warrant an evaluation for advanced therapies. And you can see what this looks like here. This was an email that we sent all of these providers where we gave them guidance on the goals of the project and then the clinical variables that could be considered when constructing these rules. And this went through an iterative process in which the 5 providers created the rules and then they subsequently revised one another's before reaching a consensus set of clinical rules. And we then use these as model inputs. Importantly, we decided to simplify these and focus again on markers of illness severity, not including contraindications. Because again, our goal was to really focus on people that we wanted to refer to advanced heart failure cardiologists. Because illness severity warranted an evaluation, although certainly future work would incorporate contraindications as well. So this is just an example here of what a rule could look like. So if the ejection fraction is low and the peak VO2 is low, then this person may warrant an evaluation for heart transplant or LVAD. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Heming.
Yes, thank you. Here I'm going to discuss some high level of the ideas in how we build these interpretable machine learning methods. I will not go into much more technical details, but if there's any questions on that, we can discuss that later. In the left panel, it shows a diagram of the proposed method. In this model, we take the tabular data as the input. So the tabular data will include the observations from the clinical examinations and also some patient information. The model's output is class on whether this patient should be evaluated for the advanced therapies, and it is a binary class. Inside of the model, it consists of the encoding module, raw module, and the inference module. In the encoding module, we were going to encode the variables into several human understandable fuzzy concept. And in the right panel, we give examples of the distance the patient walked in 6 minutes. And here we can see the variables will be encoded into 3 fuzzy concepts as low, medium, and high. So low, that means the value is relatively low. The reason we encode the variables into fuzzy concept is we are trying to mimic the human's logic. Because from our research, usually like when human makes a decision, they may not take into consider of the very complex nonlinear functions. It's rather like something that really matters is whether this value is relatively low compared with normal value. And we also like the reason for the fuzzy concept is we are going to assign a membership value for whether this variable belongs to one fuzzy concept or not. For example, let's say we have a value of 290. Then the membership of this value fall in the low concept is 0.5 and fall into the medium concept is 0.5. The reason to do that is to avoid the method to be too sensitive to the threshold of how to assign those values. And in our applications, we propose to use 3 concepts, the low, medium, and high. But it's also very easy to extend the model to include more concepts. And in the next slides, we talk about the rule module and the inference module. In these 2 modules, the compositional rules can be constructed by using a combination of the concepts and its relation to the output. Like in the left panel, the H here is showing the weights, and it's kind of the association between the concept and the output. Here I give examples of the rule, how the rule can look like. Here is the low concept of the X1 and the high concept of the X2, means the samples is positive. Like in this model, we could model a more complex rules, like with much more concept from different variables. We could say there are 2 salient properties of this proposed model. The first one is the compositional rules for classification can be constructed in this model. And after the model is trained, we can extract these compositional rules. And that's how we are saying this model is interpretable, because we can reason the model's prediction. The second property is, as we can extract the knowledge from the model, we can also fuse the existing knowledge from human to the model. That is, as Jesse said, we collected several rules from cardiologists, and then we modeled those rules and incorporated those rules into the model to initialize the model's weight. In the next slide is a kind of an overview of the process on how we are going to train the model and how we evaluate the model. So the first step is to initialize the model with rules from the heart failure cardiologist, and then the observations are, we build the training set and the validation set and the test set. All the samples in the training set, the observations will be assigned fuzzy concept, and then compositional rules are built. After the model is trained, the rules will be extracted. Here we repeated the training set for 10 times is to remove the random factors in the training process. After the repeated training for 10 times, we summarize the rules from these 10 models. Finally, we compiled the existing machine learning algorithm with the proposed one to compile the performance and also the interpretability. To evaluate this model, we look at the F1 score, precision, recall, and accuracy. We kind of think the F1 score is the most important matrix here because we want to keep a good balance between the recall and the precision. We also look at the generalization gap between the validation set and test set, because we expect our a model with a smaller generalization gap means the model have a better performance because they are less likely to be suffer from the overfitting. Finally, we also evaluate the transparency and the abilities to generate parsimonious rules. The parsimonious rules here means the rules is, first, the rule is simple. We don't want to generate a rule with numerous concept because that will make it less interpretable. Also, we want to generate a smaller set of the rules rather than maybe 100 rules, then it still make it cannot be applicable into practice. Like, yeah, I will introduce a little bit about the experimental setting. Here is a population characteristics of the two data set we used in our study. The REVIVAL site is one data set to look at the ambulatory population, and it includes both positive samples and negative samples. And this data set is also relatively a challenging data set because the positive samples is relatively have a less severe patient, while in the INTERMACS dataset, all the samples are positive. And if we look at the INTERMACS profile, the patients are more severe compared with the positive samples in the REVIVAL dataset. So for the REVIVAL dataset, we could say it's a very ideal dataset that can help us to evaluate the probabilities of using this tool to streamline the referral from the primary healthcare, primary care to specialized heart failure care. And if we go to the next slide, to keep as many as the positive samples in REVIVAL for the evaluation, we put all the positive samples in as a validation set of the test set, and also some of the negative samples in the validation set and test set. But the problem is we only have very limited sample of the positive limited number of the positive samples, and so that's kind of the reason we have to introduce INTERMACS as a part of the training samples. So the idea here is crosser information from the positive samples in INTERMACS and the negative samples in REVIVAL will help the model to differentiate a more severe patient, and then the model is kind of optimized. The hyperparameters are optimized on the validation set. Finally, all the performance of the models and the comparison with other machine learning methods are done on the test set only.
Great, thanks, Heming. So this was our results. So just to orient you here, so on the far left column, you'll see all of the different models that we use. So our model is in the top row. And then we had compared the performance of our model to a number of other different machine learning models, which you can see represented in the subsequent rows. And then the p-value you'll see is the comparison between how our model performed and compared it to the other models. And importantly, we looked at how our model performed when it was injected with this existing clinical knowledge or clinical rules, and then compared it to when it lacked that information. So importantly, our model without any clinical knowledge had an F1 score of 40.4%, which increased to 43.8% when that clinical knowledge was infused. And I've highlighted for you here two rows that we think are some of the most important. So the first looking at recall, and then the second is the F1 score. And again, we really thought the F1 score was most important because it's the harmonic mean between recall and precision. So what does that mean? It means that patients that are sick with advanced heart failure are going to get referred to an advanced heart failure specialist, but we are not going to overwhelm subspecialist resources by overwhelmingly referring patients that are too well to get advanced heart failure therapies. And so again, this is why we thought that F1 score was so important. So as you can see, our model had one of the highest, although not the highest, recall and one of the highest F1 scores. But importantly, it had the highest recall and F1 scores of the models that were both transparent and parsimonious. And again, I think Heming has told you why we thought that transparent and parsimonious models, of which there were only 3 that had both characteristics, were so important. So we really wanted to understand the rationale for a model's recommendation, and we wanted to be able to have this very short list of recommendation, a parsimonious set of rules that could be easily reviewed by treating cardiologists in their practice for validity. And so as you can see, of the 3 models that were both transparent and parsimonious, so R is decision tree and then a fuzzy inference classifier, our model performance is assessed by the recall and F1 values was far superior to both of these additional models. So we also looked at the generalization gaps, and as Heming mentioned, that's the difference in performance between the test and validation sets. And as you can see, when compared to a number of well-known and highly a number of models that performed well, ours had by far the smallest generalization gaps. So what does the output of this model look like? What does it mean when we're saying that it's transparent and parsimonious? So I know this can be a little bit hard to interpret, so I'm just going to walk you through this. So each row represents a set of rules. I'm sorry, each column represents a set of rules. So there are 11 rules that you can see on the bottom, and then each row represents a variable. And then the color indicates the contribution of the individual concepts to each compositional rule. So darker colors denote a greater contribution of that concept to the corresponding rule. So zooming in here on the first rule here. So again, this rule would say that if the albumin is low and the ejection fraction is low and the peak VO2 is either low or medium, and the patient has a low KCCQ score, then this person may warrant an evaluation for heart transplant in LVAD. And importantly, these cutoffs of low, medium, or high are defined using a combination of the rules and the data that the model is seeing. So low, for example, is not necessarily low as we define it, but is low as the model defines it. So turning now to think about some of the model strengths. So first, it can be initiated with clinical knowledge. Second, it captures and refines the imprecision in clinical decision-making, this idea of fuzzy logic. And I think that this is so cool. This for me is, Heming really introduced me to this idea, and this was something that I thought was so important. But rather than requiring specific cutoffs, the model can accommodate the recommendation from clinicians that a low peak VO2 may identify a patient as eligible for advanced therapies. But it doesn't require you to say a peak VO2 less than 12 or less than 14. You can just say, well, when I see somebody with a low peak VO2, I think that individual warrants referral for advanced heart failure therapies. And so the model, as a result, does not dichotomize these inherently gray variables, which at times exist along a continuum. And then again, the final strength that I list here is that the model is transparent. It can provide justification for its recommendations, and those recommendations can be inspected both for the validity, but also for new knowledge. And the idea is that this will really increase clinicians' confidence in the model, but also allow for serial improvement in model performance. We also think that the study design had strengths independent of those of the model. We used 2 different registries, INTERMACS and REVIVAL, both of which the data was collected in real-world practice. Thus, there was missingness and imprecision in the data, much of which you'd see in clinical practice if you were to apply this in the EMR setting. It also thus reflects diverse patients, diverse practice patterns. We use all but simplified clinical rules that were created from the input of 5 different heart failure and transplant cardiologists that are practicing at different academic medical centers. And then we removed subjective variables such as NYHA classification and INTERMACS classification, as we felt these were rather subjective and deterministic. accepting that there was a decrement in model performance when we removed these variables. So in terms of the limitations of our study, the REVIVAL data set is relatively small. And so to overcome this, we did have to combine the two data sets. And there were some differences in variable measurement and also in the patient populations, which Heming highlighted. INTERMACS certainly captures a overall sicker patient population. And the two data sets combined had the majority of patients receive an advanced therapy, which is very different than what we see right in real world practice. The majority of our patients do not get an advanced therapy. We also terminated follow-up at the time of advanced therapy receipt. So we didn't follow patients. This was a limitation of the REVIVAL data set. And we didn't see how patients did after they received either an LVAD or a transplant. And thus our model is identifying patients that warrant referral for advanced heart failure therapies, but is not yet identifying those patients that are most likely to benefit. And finally, we view this as an early stage development. And so we trained the model with variables that already have known associations, at least to some extent, with advanced heart failure. So this all kind of feeds into what we think of as coming in the pipeline. So the next step is moving from classification to prediction. Right now, we are classifying patients at a single point in time based on the data that's available to us as warranting referral for evaluation for heart failure advanced therapies. But ideally, we wouldn't be kind of reacting to that, but we'd be predicting it and referring patients before they need an advanced therapy evaluation. We also, in the future, would like to include patients that had post-transplant, post-LVAD outcomes available, and so that we could develop potentially a model that identifies patients not only that warrant referral, but can also identify those patients that are most likely to benefit from advanced therapies and possibly not refer patients who are unlikely to benefit. We'd also like to use expanded variables to allow for new clinical knowledge. So certainly we saw some novel combinations of variables, but for the most part, we had started with variables that we knew had associations with advanced heart failure. And so while certainly this can be deployed in the EMR setting and we imagine would be helpful to non-heart failure cardiologists, it limited the extent to which we could learn from the clinical rules. And then finally, we hope to apply this methodology to similar clinical problems with small data sets, and in which there were sensitive decisions, timely decisions. So in conclusion here, we hope we've shown you that we developed a machine learning model that's capable of identifying patients with advanced heart failure that warrant a referral or an evaluation for transplant or LVAD. And we believe that the model outperformed many or most of the commonly used machine learning models. And importantly, it was the best performing model with respect to those that were transparent and accessible. And thus, we believe that this can be helpful in informing clinical decision-making. A huge thank you to the people that helped with this work, some of whom you may know, Dr. Aronson and Dr. Pagani, and then methodologically, Dr. Najarian and Dr. Gryak. And for those of you that are interested in more details, this just came out officially this week in JHLT. And with that, we will stop and happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, thanks so much to the both of you for such a great presentation. I personally would like to open the floor for questions. I know we have a couple of people here that are more in tune with machine learning than others. So perhaps if either Dr. Ahmad or Dr. Wilson, if you have any questions or comments, since I think that the two of you probably have a better understanding of the science than the rest of us. I'd like to invite either of you first to make a comment or ask a question.
Well, Mike, this is a great presentation. I don't really have any questions. Really, really excellent work.
Thanks so much.
Well, I think, the thing that strikes me is that, as you started with your introduction, that this is a clinical situation that, we too commonly come across in that as heart failure cardiologists, we don't see a good number of patients diagnosed with heart failure. And being able to have some type of a tool like this to help those that are taking care of these patients direct them to our clinics, I think would be such an amazing thing to have available to us. I think the machine learning side of the science is something that's way above my head, something that I don't even want to try to pretend I have even a detail of knowledge about that part of the science. But I think this type of a project and application would be really a wonderful endeavor. And I hope that you guys are able to continue to develop it and bring it forward in the time to come. Any other questions or comments out there from the group?
So certainly this is work that we're hoping to try and extend as part of the grant. We've used it to try and validate the model using data in the University of Michigan, and specifically also to look at patients that died that did not get an advanced therapies evaluation. So we've been implementing it in REMR and in a very research setting using only retrospective data at this point. And then are also trying to look at this idea of prediction. So using variables from 2 time points to predict the need for advanced therapies in the future. So that's certainly that work that's in development right now and hoping to share soon.
Well, if there's no other comments from the group, I want to thank the both of you for taking your time to share the work with us. Again, I think this is really interesting, and I'm sure that, I guess I will keep my fingers crossed that it's something that we make use of someday down the road to help, steer patients into our practices and get them the therapies that they need. So Dr. Golbus, Dr. Yao, thank you so much for joining. And for the rest of the group, thank you. Happy holidays to all, and we'll see everybody sometime after the new year.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction and the opportunity to speak, and hope everybody has a wonderful holiday.
All right, bye-bye.